I want to begin with this statement. The state of Maryland continues to maintain and perpetuate a separate and unequal system of higher education that is segregated by race and which discriminates against the constitutional rights of the students who attend the state's 4 historically Black institutions, and a remedy is required. That is the ruling of a federal district judge in a case brought against the state of Maryland not in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, but in 2006. And that's the ruling of a federal district judge sitting in Baltimore in the year 2013 in litigation that was not completed until last May. The court made that ruling based upon findings of fact and conclusions of law that there are policies and practices in place right now traceable to the state's foundational racism and white supremacy that was clearly evident in the eras of slavery and the slave trade, through the atrocities of the lynching of Black men, women, and children in this state, and through the era of Jim Crow segregation. And that those policies and practices, either by design, purpose, and intent, or by discriminatory effect and impact, violated the constitutional rights of African American students in this state and prevented them from meaningful educational opportunities that were otherwise available to their white counterparts in the state. I'm going to return to that case in a few minutes, but I just want to get your attention, because we're not talking about ancient history or even recent history. We're talking about the status of things right now while you go to Morgan State University, while I'm on the faculty at Morgan State University, and while we see racism and discrimination raging all around us. And I want to use this case in a few minutes as an example of the institutionalized, systemic, and structural racism that we really have to confront if we want to root it out. So I hope that got your attention a little bit. As Dr. Jackson said, my name is Pace McConkie. I'm the director of the Robert M. Bell Center for Civil Rights and Education here on campus. Named after Judge Robert M. Bell, who spoke here in this room just 1 month ago to maybe some of you who were here. The Robert M. Bell Center was established primarily, among other things, to identify and address any continuing policy or practice in education at any level, so elementary, secondary, higher education, any policy or practice which fosters discrimination on the basis of race or perpetuates the inequities of segregation by race. And then through research, teaching, training, and advocacy, seek the elimination of those policies and practices and replacing them with racially just practices and programs. That's the purpose of the Bell Center, which I'm very privileged to be able to direct right now. Whatever I say to you today comes in the context of my life's work as a civil rights lawyer, advocate, and activist. So I just throw that out at you right now so that you know that my perspective is that perspective. And that I went to law school for this very purpose, so that I could be engaged in rooting out racist policies and practices and trying to replace them with racially just policies and practices. So believe it or not, my models in the law, my heroes, were the Thurgood Marshalls of the world. Constance Baker Motley, Juanita Jackson Mitchell from Baltimore, Lily Carroll Jackson from Baltimore, Charles Hamilton Houston. So you know that Thurgood Marshall was born and raised in Baltimore, right? And he couldn't go to the University of Maryland schools. He went to a historically black institution, Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. And when he wanted to go to law school, he couldn't even apply to the University of Maryland Law School solely because of his race. So he went to Howard University, a better law school, where the dean of the law school was a man named Charles Hamilton Houston, a brilliant lawyer. And this brilliant lawyer had a mantra that he trained his law students in. And that mantra is this: a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. You heard that before? A lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite. And what's a parasite? Just sucking off the blood of society, making your way through as a lawyer, getting rich, making money. And he said, you're either a social engineer or you're a parasite. Now, I'm no Thurgood Marshall, I'm no Charlie Houston, but I've tried to apply that in my legal practice and in everything else that I'm doing in my life. And I've also learned, by the way, that if it's true of lawyers, it's true of educators, it's true of doctors, it's true of businessmen and women, it's true of teachers, it's true of all of us. Police officers, security officers, everybody. We're either trying to move society to a much better place, and in this instance, Hamilton Houston's talking about fighting racism and race discrimination. We're either doing that, moving towards what Martin Luther King called, the beloved society, or we're parasites. And that requires us to exercise our values, our voices, our votes, and do whatever we can within our own circles and our own spheres to move society to that better place. Now, in order to confront racism, and in order to advance racial justice, then obviously we need to have some working definition of racism. Now again, I'm going to say the obvious. No one in this room needs me to tell you what racism is. You don't. I don't experience racism that you experience. I don't have that directed against me. You do, in some fashion, virtually every day, with every institution with which you interact. But again, I have learned things in my life, and I have been able to gain perspective through my work as a civil rights lawyer, an advocate, an activist, primarily in the African American and Latino communities, advancing the cause of civil rights and the cause of racial justice as an ally and an advocate and an activist, arm in arm with people of color. So I hope that you might accept that I have learned some things and have a perspective from which I think I can define racism as well. And I'll offer it to you, and you just see if it's consistent with your knowledge, your experience, and what you have to deal with in your lives. And I come to define racism in two parts. One is the ideology of racism, which would be, in its most simple terms, I guess, where a person or a group of persons falsely believes and claims, I think repugnantly falsely believes and claims, that he or she is superior to another person or group of persons solely because of race. When you define it in those simple terms, it seems absurd. But I have learned that is the ideology of racism. But that's not enough to define racism and identify racism so that we can confront it. On top of that ideology, there must be actions taken. Sometimes those actions are in the form of laws, regulations, ordinances, always in terms of policy and practice, and often just in terms of very ugly behavior. But it's not enough just to have that ideology of racism without actions which are put in place to build a power structure and a social structure to maintain a privileged status for one race. The race, in this instance, the white race, has anointed itself the privileged race. And so, based on racist ideology, they have implemented actions, policies, and practices to build a power structure and a social structure to maintain a privileged status. Is that at all consistent with what you might believe or experience? And so, sometimes it's easy to identify racism and confront it. But other times it's much more subtle. So it's more difficult to do so for some people. So, for example, when a young man walks into a Bible study at Mother AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and ends up opening fire and killing everyone in the room, and then declares that he did it because he wants to start a race war and advance white supremacy. That's so revolting, it's so blatant, that most people will say that is racism and it must be condemned. Or when we see white supremacists marching in Charlottesville, Virginia, carrying tiki torches and chanting white supremacist slogans like, "You will not replace us," or "Jew will not replace us." It's easy for most people to condemn that. It's blatant. And it's revolting. Or when Ahmaud Arbery is chased down by 3 white men and cornered and murdered, lynched on a residential street in Georgia while he's jogging. See, blatant racism is easy to identify and condemn and confront it. what must we then do in society to stop such racism? But the systemic, structural, institutionalized racism, which we confront in virtually every institution with which we interact in society every day, is harder to confront because it's harder to identify. It's harder to identify it with blatant racists and white supremacists, or to tag people with those labels rightfully. But it's harder to do that because we're talking about policies and practices which have been in place since slavery and continued through Jim Crow segregation and have been maintained in some form and some fashion in order to maintain white privilege and in order to perpetuate racism to maintain a privileged status. Now, I offer those definitions, hoping it's consistent. Does anyone dispute that or want to go on record, because we're on YouTube, to dispute that, or is it generally your experience? So let's look back at that case that I talked about as an example, okay? We know, I told you that Thurgood Marshall could not go to the University of Maryland solely because of his race. Couldn't go to law school in this state solely because of his race. So the state of Maryland, for decades, maintained a racially segregated system of higher education. And then Brownsville Board of Education came along in 1956, and the Supreme Court ruled, and Thurgood Marshall argued that case. And the Supreme Court ruled, and I'll just read you one quote from Brownsville Board of Education. Now, this is back in 1954, so the gender pronouns are consistent with 1954. But this is what the court said. Today, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. Compulsory school attendance laws and the great expenditures for education both demonstrate our recognition of the importance of education to our democratic society. It is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities, even service in the armed forces. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. Today, it is a principal instrument in awakening the child to cultural values, in preparing him for later professional training, in helping him to adjust normally to his environment. In these days, it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity of an education. And then here's the kicker. Such an opportunity, where the state has undertaken to provide it, is a right that must be made available to all on equal terms. Now, Brownsville Board of Education was a consolidation of several cases brought in several states on behalf of elementary and secondary school children. But it applied equally to higher education, public higher education. The court ruled that separate is inherently unequal, not because it determined that a black student and a white student have to sit next to each other in school or in college in order to learn, but because of the gaping inequities that followed segregation by race in terms of funding, budgets, facilities, faculty, staff, academic programs, missions, everything that's necessary to provide an adequate, excellent education to anybody. It was shown by Thurgood Marshall and that cadre of lawyers under the direction of Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the architect of the legal strategy to dismantle segregation in this country. It was shown in the courts the inherent inequities that came by segregation by race. And so the court ordered the end of that practice and those policies and said that implementation of remedies needed to happen with all deliberate speed, which didn't happen, as evidenced by the fact that we were still litigating these very issues in Maryland up until May of last year, more than 60 years later. The court said that the states had an obligation to eradicate the vestiges of segregation root and branch. And then ultimately, in later cases, based on Brownsville Board of Education, specifically addressing higher education and HBCUs, a case coming out of Mississippi in 1992 called U.S. v. Fordyce, the court said that standard. Any continuing policy or practice that fosters discrimination on the basis of race or perpetuates the inequities of segregation by race must be eliminated, especially when there is no sound educational justification for them. And they had to be ended. So in 2006, when a coalition of students, faculty, and supporters of Maryland's 4 HBCUs, including Morgan students, filed a lawsuit against the state. They didn't file a lawsuit or complaint claiming, the governor, the legislature, the chancellor of higher education, the board of regents, they're all a bunch of racists. They're all a bunch of white supremacists, and they're out to discriminate against us. That's not the case that was filed. That may or may not be true, but that's not what the case was about. The case was filed on assertions that the state of Maryland has failed to dismantle its former de jure, that means officially segregated, racially discriminatory system of higher education, and that there were policies and practices that remain in place right now that perpetuate that discriminatory system. You see the distinction there? It's hard to go to court and say, the leadership in the state is racist. The education boards and the chancellors, they're racist. But the racism is just as real when there are policies and practices in place that were put in place since slavery and maintained through all those years of Jim Crow segregation that was supposed to end in 1954, but didn't, to the point that in 2006, a federal suit had to be brought claiming that the state of Maryland has failed to remove its policies and practices that fostered discrimination on the basis of race and perpetuated the inequities of segregation by race. What are some of the policies and practices that were addressed in that lawsuit? Well, it had to do with the way the state provided funding and budgets for historically black institutions. It had to do with the way missions were assigned to historically black institutions. It had to do with the way academic programs were assigned to the various campuses and approved. And if an academic program was at a historically black college, why was it duplicated at a nearby traditionally white institution? The very practices that the state of Maryland put into place, starting with slavery and through Jim Crow, remained in place in 2006. And the evidence established that, and the federal district judge agreed and said that that is the case. Is this making sense to you in the context of that definition of racism that we gave? Racism is the ideology of racial superiority, false though it may be, coupled with actions, policies, practices to maintain a privileged status for white people. In reality, it's just that plain and simple. And so the court agreed with the coalition and said remedies are required. And the remedies, the way the court agreed was specifically on the way the state approved academic programs, assigned them to various campuses, and then duplicated programs at the HBCUs at nearby traditionally white institutions. So if Morgan had a successful MBA program going, well, the state duplicated that MBA program up at Towson or at UB. Or when the state said that there was we need a greater capacity to meet the educational need in the Baltimore region, instead of looking to Morgan and Coppin to meet those needs, it created a whole new institution, UMBC. Rather than enhancing Morgan and enhancing Coppin to meet an educational need of the Baltimore region, the state said, we'll just copy. We'll just duplicate. We'll create a whole new institution. And the court said those policies and practices are what you did to segregate in the first place. And you're still doing it. And so it required a remedy. And that remedy meant new high-demand programs at the HBCUs that would not be duplicated elsewhere. And just last May, the state of Maryland finally agreed upon a sum of money to provide for those programs and to make sure that they were prosperous and successful for years and decades to come. I don't want to get too much more into details, but I'm trying to overemphasize a point. And that is that the actions and policies and practices that perpetuate racism and discrimination and maintain white privilege are not things of the past. They're still here. And we have to figure out how to identify them so that we can confront them and challenge them and seek their elimination and replace them with racially just policies and practices. And that's really our challenge in 2022. Now, do you think we could have this same discussion outside of the context of higher education? I know we can have it in the context of elementary and secondary education because I was involved in those cases too. So, for example, policies and practices in more than 90% of the school districts in this country include the ability, grouping, and tracking of students, which means that students as young as kindergartners and first graders are subjected to assessments, informal assessments and tests to determine their perceived ability to learn and to assess their perceived behavior. And then placing those students into groups, academic groups, lower groups, middle groups, high achieving groups. And then the data showed that if you were placed in a lower level group, for example, in reading, if an informal assessment determined that a student was a slow reader in first grade, then that student was automatically assigned to lower level groups in math, science, and social studies. And then the data showed that those students did not break out of those groups in third grade or fifth grade or eighth grade. And before long, they were not on the college-bound tracks, but were on more dead-end tracks. You see, those are policies and practices of school systems that have been in place for decades, especially in segregated school systems. Because the data showed what you predict, right? That black students were disproportionately placed in the lower level groupings and white students in the higher level groupings. And that even black and white students with the same test scores placed black students in the lower level groups. Same test scores, same assessment. Same analysis could be done with the administration of discipline in our schools, resulting in suspensions or expulsions or arrests, removing children from mainstream opportunities to learn in the classroom. Black students and white students engaged in the same behavior, resulted in black students being disciplined at a much higher rate than the white students. So, yeah, we could have this discussion about elementary and secondary schools too. What about other institutions with which we interact outside of education? Let me name just a few. Business. Are there policies and practices in the business world which foster discrimination on the basis of race and lock black and brown people out of business opportunities? Like the business practice of redlining, predatory lending. Are there similar practices in employment and labor, the economy, housing, government, and the business of government, political empowerment, and voting? Do African American and Latino voters still face voter suppression policies and practices to keep them from voting? Or if they do vote, to keep their votes from counting? We're talking about voter suppression and voter subversion, vote subversion. Remember the 2020 election when the results were trying to be challenged by Trump and the Republicans, the focus was on 4 swing states, right? Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin primarily. Now Arizona also. Okay, so 5. But in each of those instances, where was the focus of the challenge? Atlanta, Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Phoenix. Cities and jurisdictions with large African American populations and voters. So yeah, policies and practices are in place right now. And sadly, they are increasing in states, not decreasing in states, which means we have to be ever more vigilant to identify them and confront them in an effort to root them out. What are some of the other institutions with which we interact? The civil justice system. How about the criminal justice system? Policies and practices that have to do with law enforcement, policing, incarceration, arrests, detainment, pretrial hearings, everything. How about the institution, if I can use that word, of the environment and environmental justice? Just today, before I came to work, I read the Washington Post, and on the front page of the Washington Post was a cover story about a community in New Orleans called Gordon Plaza, which is a community, an African American community of houses built on top of a toxic waste dump in New Orleans, which the city of New Orleans at the time never disclosed to the home buyers. And now it is found that there are 149 toxic substances under their homes, 49 of which are cancer causing. And that's just being made known to those who live in that community. Policies and practices which allowed that to happen. And it's not happening in predominantly white neighborhoods, but it's happening in predominantly black and brown neighborhoods. So I could go on. The institutions of public accommodations, immigration, healthcare, even religion. I'm just trying to identify with you the major institutions with which we react, with which we interact every day in some fashion, whether it's banking, or whatever. My experience and yours establishes that there are policies and practices in place right now that are traceable to the years of slavery, Jim Crow segregation. And we know why they were implemented during the eras of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. We know why they were implemented. It was to discriminate on the basis of race and to segregate on the basis of race and to maintain the privileged status of one race over another. And I use the Maryland higher education case as just one example of how those policies and practices remain in place. And to me, that's what we mean when we talk about systemic racism, institutionalized racism. Now, to conclude, you have heard reactions to this, because we all read the news and we hear what some politicians say, especially after egregious racism is exposed, like the shooting down at AME Church in Charleston, or George Floyd's death at the hands of police officers. What was the typical reaction of white leadership in the community? What do you think was a typical reaction? Well, let's say with respect to policing. Well, we acknowledge that there are a few bad actors out there. We acknowledge that there are one or two police officers who are probably racist. And we can root them out. We can get rid of them. But don't tell us that there's systemic racism in policing. Don't try to convince us that racism in America is institutionalized or that it is structural. That's the reaction that we heard over and over again, when the data shows otherwise, showing that there are policies and practices in policing that are rooted in slavery and slave catchers, which really began law enforcement in an organized way in this country. And, you know, as I said, in the higher education case, we don't have to go to court and allege that the chancellor of higher education is a racist. No. We simply have to show that there are policies and practices that are discriminatory and that perpetuate racism and segregation and discrimination with all of their inequities. And we can do that in virtually every institution with which we interact every day. And I know that's true. And it's ironic, too, that in these cases that I've been involved in, the defense is often something like this. You can't blame us, the school system of higher education. You can't blame us for inequities that are caused by greater societal discrimination. That's not our fault, a school system would say. You can't blame us for that because there's so much racism and discrimination in society that children are coming to our schools burdened with that, and you can't blame us if they're not advancing academically or if they're being suspended. It's not our fault because racism is so pervasive in society. These are the same voices that are now saying there's no structural systemic racism. Just one or two bad actors out there. It's pretty ironic. But it puts us on the alert. So what do we do? What do we need to do? What can we do? I offer this. There are 4 traditional pillars of civil rights advocacy that we've seen through the civil rights movement in this country. Especially in the 60s, when they were marching in Selma for the right to vote, when they were marching in Washington, D.C. for jobs and justice, when we saw police dogs and fire hoses being sicked on African Americans. We've seen the black and white footage. We still have that as a matter of record. But in those instances, there were 4 pillars of civil rights advocacy, which I want to suggest to you strongly are still the 4 pillars of advocacy for us today. Education, agitation, litigation, and legislation. Even in the higher education case in Maryland, all that litigation would have gone nowhere but for agitation of students and activists demanding their rights to an adequate education without trying to educate each other and our families and our friends and associates and the community as to the significance of these issues and why they must be addressed. Support for the litigation that went on for 17 years and didn't officially end until the Maryland General Assembly passed bills signed by the governor to fund a constitutional remedy. Same in the 60s. All the protests, all the teach-ins, all the advocacy, all the lawsuits eventually ended up in legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Housing Rights Act of 1968, and so forth. Consider those things. In our own circles and spheres, okay? We're not all litigators. We're certainly not all legislators. But can we influence litigation? And can we influence legislation? And certainly, are we not all in a position to educate and agitate? Protest where appropriate. Of course, nonviolent protest has always been the rule and the most effective means. But think about it. In your own lives, are you in a position to educate yourselves on these issues? And what you learn, to share it with friends, associates, family members, the community? And we have a lot more means to do that than they had in 1965 with social media and opportunities to get the word out or let your voices be heard. And the same is true of agitation. Sometimes agitation is very effective in the form of protest, like we saw after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, and how meaningful and effective they were. But that's not the only way to agitate. You know, we can do that on social media. We can write letters to the editor. We can have town hall meetings. We can show up at city council meetings. We can make our voices heard in what I call agitation. And that obviously comes from Frederick Douglass, who said, you know, when asked how come he was so effective in his movement to abolish slavery, and his response was agitate, agitate, agitate. So I think our values and our voices and are manifest through education and agitation. And that includes voting. Were any of you here when Judge Robert M. Bell spoke a month ago? And he addressed so eloquently the rising threats to democracy. And for virtually every problem that was raised and every question that had to be answered, his answer was vote. It's the only way ultimately to address it. Vote and make sure your vote counts. And so I just conclude with that. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have or to hear your comments, even if they're not questions. But within our own circles, our own spheres, in ways that are natural and normal to us, consider how we can educate ourselves and others for the purpose of identifying barriers to racial justice. Anywhere you might see a discriminatory policy and practice, learn about it. Consider how to confront it. Talk to each other about it. Educate each other and me. And then consider what agitation is required. What form of making sure our voice is heard forcefully, including the vote. We can leave litigation to the litigators. We can leave legislation to the legislators. But we don't dare do that without educating them and agitating them and making sure our influence is felt in that litigation and in that legislation. And when it comes to legislation, that requires our vote. I hope that's helpful. It's my perspective. I share it with you. I feel strongly and passionately about it. But I hope that we can go forward and make our values realized in the community, our voices heard, our votes cast, and continue to educate and agitate while the process of litigation and legislation goes forward. And you know what? If we do that, what does that make us? Social engineers, as opposed to parasites on society. Thanks.
Mr. McConkie, I hope these students took copious notes because this was a fantastic, superb, excellent presentation on making sure that our voice is heard. And this was excellent. Let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you.
I am just so. This is the end of our lecture series, and this is a dynamic way to go out. You have given us such great information, such knowledge. I'm sure you students have some questions to ask. Do you have any questions or comments? Go ahead. Take your. You can take.
I have a comment. Your speech, it was really interesting to listen to everything they said to me. And one comment I would like to make is like our whole everything in America is like off for racism. So it's harder to really like try to push your way because there's still people that are alive that like most people in the system that are alive they are being taught that from their elders and things like that because there's still people that are still alive from that time of day, so it's kind of harder to educate the older generation than it is the, but it can start like teaching our generation and the generation to come. I feel like over time it's gonna take a while, but if we get to a place where equality is something that we can work harder towards.
That's a great comment. And it's a hopeful comment. That as the rising generations come up, that the ideology of racism will begin to die. That's hopeful. I agree with it. I think we're always going to be dealing with it to some degree. But it also will cause us to confront even more the policies and practices of racism, which the younger generation is not responsible for, but which are so entrenched in our institutions that they still have to be addressed and they still have to be challenged, if that makes sense. So your comment is filled with hope, tempered by the need to be vigilant and keep going in that direction. Thank you.
Any other question? But I want you guys to think, reflect on everything that you've heard, and reflect on your life. Has anything that Mr. McConkie said had any impact on you? Or did you experience anything, like even when you were in middle school or high school? Were there students, maybe not you, but other students who were categorized in certain areas? Go ahead.
Yeah, that was big in high school. Like there was honors classes, AP classes, and then just like the grade level. And a lot of people that were in grade level classes, things like that, what they call it, they weren't really motivated to get good grades or finish high school. They probably felt like, oh, well, these people are honors AP. I'm not really doing much. So I think the way that they did systems and how we learned things, they did have a big impact on people because they felt like that's what they were stuck there.
Yeah, when you think about elementary and secondary school, the administrators don't say, okay, Johnny, you're in the low group, and Billy, you're in the middle group, and Jane, you're in the high achieving group. They don't say that. But what do? They just think of cute little names, like, okay, Johnny's in the zebra group, and Billy's in the lion group, and Jane's in the Cubs group.
Yeah.
And let's all be excited and let's go forward, and not realizing that they were being placed into low and middle achieving based upon perception, perceived ability to learn, without giving them an opportunity to break out. I think all educators would agree that some kids might be slower learning how to read than others. So if you're a slow reader in first grade, we can deal with that. But that doesn't mean that they are still slow readers in third grade and fifth grade. With the right education and opportunities, they break out of it and they can be fast learners. And so the key is to make sure that nobody's locked in to some non-college bound track that eliminates their opportunities from the earliest stages.
But something that I want to add, Mr. McConkie said there are 4 things that we should do. 1 is to educate, 2, agitate, 3, litigate, 4, legislate, right? You came here this evening and you really ought to be commended. So now you can start the education process by going out to your friends and say, hey, this is what I learned today. And I hope you will listen to me and let us do something about it, because we are the next generation. Something also is that Judge Bell mentioned the fact about voting. This year is a year when there's going to be election. This is an election year. So you need to start participating. You need to start finding out what's going on, who is going to be running for offices, and how are you going to participate in this, okay? Because now is your turn to do something that's going to provide education, agitation, litigation, and legislation. And you want to make sure that those people who are legislating have your interest of heart and not to perpetuate what has been going on since slavery.
Yeah, and the vote's the only way we can do that, ultimately. And you think about the legislation that is so dangerous that's happening right now, where they're actually legislating away the right to vote, legislating away the protection of the vote, and in other instances as well. I mean, down in Florida, the Don't Say Gay bill. You been reading about that?
Yes.
Where they passed legislation, where you can't even talk about sexual identity or sexual orientation in any way, shape, or form.
Yep.
That's the result of legislation. And legislation is only effectively addressed through the democratic process of voting and getting out the vote. And once votes are cast, making sure that they are counted and protected, and then holding those elected accountable for their efforts to legislate and so forth. So I agree with Judge Bell.
Yes.
As discouraging as it is, ultimately, voting is our best answer.
Yes. And
Yes,
we have, go
I
ahead.
disagree with all these statues that they're moving. The Talbot, some people tore down the statue of Christopher Columbus near the Inner Harbor, and nobody's been prosecuted for that. That was a violation of the state that this tore down a statue and had to dig it up. Nobody's put it back up. These people that these statues were made of lived at a different time when there was a different culture. And we need to accept that that's part of our history and not just disregard it.
Okay, I mean, I think that's a fair comment. I think that if statues are removed unlawfully through vandalism and so forth, that's one issue. If statues are removed lawfully through public policy, that's a perfectly acceptable issue. And the question is, whether or not it's part of our history, should it be exalted and celebrated? If it should just be acknowledged and recognized as part of our history, then there might be other ways to do that, like in a museum or in history books. But you have to consider what it means to all Americans, black, brown, and white, to have, for example, a statue of Confederate leaders who went to war against this country for the purpose of maintaining slavery. That's offensive. And the question is, should that be celebrated in the public square, or should it be acknowledged as a part of history, like you said, lawfully, through policy? That's how I might respond. Others might have you got comments?
So like, depending on how you were brought up, you acknowledge certain parts of history and then you sweep some under the rug. So in terms of like, you may acknowledge it, like Christopher Columbus statue and things of that nature, but it could also have been Harriet Tubman statue that was vandalized that didn't get the same coverage as say your Christopher Columbus or a Confederate or something. So it's just based off accepting some history and not accepting some. It's not really it's 50-50 if you know what I'm saying. It's not really.
It's a good comment and it's a good answer. Yes, sir.
2024 has been declared by the UN as the International Decade for People of African Descent. And as a part of the celebration of this decade, a study has been done by the UN under the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Ashley. Last year, she issued a report in which she warned the international community, especially countries where racism is the way of life. She warned them to stop denying racism and start dismantling this phenomenon.
Perfect.
That's very powerful statement
That's perfect.
coming from the UN. And so I quoted a statement by Michelle Bachelet to stress the importance of this kind of meeting where we are discussing racism. Because believe it or not, there are still people who deny racism. Believe it or not, in this country, we have had the opportunity to have a U.S. president who was a certified racist. And I say very seriously because he was condemned by the U.S. Congress for a racist comment against some members of Congress. So it's very important discussion. It's very But we do it every day, more or less. But we have to talk about it. It's part of the way to stop denying it and start dismantling it. The problem, as I see, is when we have the discussion by somebody who knows a lot about this issue in front of an audience, most of whom are on the receiving end of this practice. I would hope and I wish that this discussion also takes place where most of the audience are not on the receiving end of racism.
I agree.
That's it.
I agree completely. And I accept every invitation that I get to address this issue with white students and white audiences, and agree with you that that is so important to have those discussions in predominantly white communities. I couldn't agree with you more. And I couldn't agree with you more with the statement that it's time to stop denying racism and start dismantling racism. Even those who deny that racism exists are mostly talking about what we've discussed tonight. The systemic, institutional racism, the policies and practices that remain in place. Remember, most people will condemn that vile, blatant racism and still deny any structure or system that may have caused it or certainly perpetuates it. Your comments are excellent, and I agree with them 100%. Thank you for that.